Great. Okay, thank you for joining us. A little bit more about the section of the handbook on the science of Montessori education, and then I welcome some of the contributors to tell us a little bit about their chapters before we open it up for questions. So the science of Montessori education section was really sort of the bridge between some of the grounding and the historical pieces of Montessori education, and then looking towards the future. So what I tried to do in that section was start with some of the historical philosophical connections of Montessori education with neuroscience through Mara Fabri's chapter, and then really provide some of the foundational chapters on resources that folks could use to have some foundational background about Montessori research, including some of the work on the logic model of Montessori education, and then the chapter that I co-authored with my colleague Carolyn Doust, looking at Montessori fidelity and sort of the history of it and how we deal with it today. And then other colleagues really brought us up to date with some specific chapters on research, kind of looking at the literature on particular aspects of Montessori education. And so I think with that, I will introduce some of those authors who are here with us today to talk about their chapters and give us a little bit of an introduction. So I think I see that Angeline's not muted, so I'll ask her to start, and then perhaps Karen can join us after that.
All right. So and it's like 1 minute.
That'd be great. Yes, and then we'll have time to chat.
Okay, so I worked on this chapter with a graduate student, Ava Bazakigar, and we had started a study looking at children's motivation, sort of following up on some of what Kevin Ratund and Chitzat Mahai had published back in 2005, but doing a contemporary survey to see how motivation levels are for children in Montessori, looking from 3rd to 8th grade, using some questionnaires that children, by those ages can fill out. And the standard finding is that motivation declines every year that children are in school from the time we can measure 3rd grade on. And so we're curious, what do we see when we look at Montessori? The pandemic then interrupted that research, and we actually have been collecting that data again. But this was the kind of theoretical underpinnings of that. We used DC and Ryan's self-determination framework and discussed that with reference to Montessori.
Excellent.
Sorry, I'm still not sure about
Karen, I'll let you dive in and tell us about your chapter.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, be part of this conversation. I'm Karen Manship, and I was the author for the Evaluating the Efficacy of Montessori Education chapter within this section. And I really appreciate all the feedback that I got from Angela, from Angela, and from Mira, from others. We reviewed the chapter aims to kind of review the research that is published in English, but not just in the United States, on the efficacy of Montessori education at each level. So one thing that I learned was that there is much more, there's sort of a growing body of evidence in this area in general. Not a lot of really rigorous studies yet. We're working on that. Angeline and I and others are working on a national study of Montessori right now that draws on admission lotteries. So that's going to be a randomized controlled trial of Montessori, which we're really excited about. So in the meantime, we summarized what was known about the efficacy of Montessori education at the primary level, at the elementary level, at the secondary level. There's a lot more research at the primary level in early childhood. We looked at how Montessori education can support children's academic skills as well as other skills that support learning. And the chapter also talks about some challenges in research and researching the efficacy of Montessori. And one of those is just sort of defining what Montessori means and looking at the importance of fidelity in that research and when it cannot be sort of included in research. And it was nice to be able to tie that to some other chapters in this section too, where we're discussing fidelity in more depth. That's one challenge. Another challenge is really figuring out what outcomes to look at, because Montessori has a lot of goals that really focuses on the whole child's development. And so should we just be looking at academic measures? How do we measure some of these non-academic skills? And then another challenge is really implementing these strong controls. So as the research body grows, we do have a lot of studies that are looking at, sort of using administrative data or smaller samples. And so that gives us some information for sure, but it doesn't give us as rigorous information as if we have sort of quasi-experimental designs or experimental randomized designs. And so we tried to summarize the research by the strength of design, as well as by different outcomes and by different levels, primary, elementary, and secondary. So we're trying to do a lot of things in a short chapter. And but I think it was really a pleasure to work on this and kind of take a stab at summarizing what we know so far.
Excellent. Yeah, it was. That's a tough charge that you had with that chapter. So, but both Karen's chapter and Angeline's chapter both are really important contributions to the handbook. I don't see other authors joining us. I'm not missing anyone, am I? That's not on my screen. Okay, great. So I think at this point, we're a small enough group that I don't think we need to raise hands. I think that if you wanted to chat with the authors or with me and have questions or make comments about the Science of Montessori section, we'd be happy to chat about it. And I have questions if you don't.
I have a question.
Great.
I'm Gary. I'm head of the Lexington Montessori School in Massachusetts. I am not a scholar. I just think Montessori is what all children should have. So I'm very curious about what we think efficacy means. You talked about outcomes, and I think the efficacy of conventional education is suspect at best. So I just wonder how do you enter into that realm of what works and what doesn't for kids? It just seems so huge.
I'll start, and then maybe Karen, you can jump in, and I'm sure Angela, and I'm sure you have some great ideas here too. I think part of the challenge with this handbook is trying to speak the language of non-Montessori people as well. And so using the word efficacy may not be the kind of terminology that we often use within the Montessori field, is in terms of that's not how we talk about a child's and outcomes are not the sort of the language we use. But for this chapter, we felt like it was important to speak the language of the field. And so that was really in talking with Karen about the chapter and thinking about her charge with that chapter. I think that being able to bridge both the Montessori field and the broader field of education is sort of what we were going for. But Karen, I'd love for you to talk more about that.
Yeah, that's such a big picture. Great question. And I think what we were trying to do was summarize what we know about Montessori education compared to other types of education, more traditional education. And so it might help to sort of give a sense of what we learned by looking across different studies. We looked at, as I mentioned, the sort of academic outcomes, and we found that a lot of studies, especially the ones that had stronger designs, really point to a strong effectiveness in terms of Montessori supporting English language arts skills. So stronger scores for kids in that area compared to more traditional education settings. There's sort of more mixed evidence when it comes to math, but we also looked at all these other, I'm just going to scroll to my thought section. So we had sort of an academic skills section of the chapter, and then another section of the chapter that looks at other skills supportive of learning. So we think about Montessori as supporting executive function for kids. We think about it supporting creativity and other skills like that. So there was a sort of a diverse set of findings in those studies about how Montessori can support those skills. But we're really trying to understand how Montessori outcomes compare to, or how these skills that Montessori kids demonstrate compare to the skills that kids in more traditional programs demonstrate. And I hope I'm starting to answer your question. I welcome follow-up conversation.
Yeah, maybe Angela, you want to dive in there, and then we can kind of follow up.
Sure. Yeah, no, I resonate a lot with what you're saying. And I sometimes look around at, the state of the country and think, how much is this the result of making teachers focus on No Child Left Behind tests? That there's not a lot of kind of, where do we find meaning in life? How do we connect with each other? How do we understand that all human beings are one family at root? And what's happening in conventional schools has not been doing that. And, people whose, hearts go out to children usually want to teach, but then when we force them to do all these things that the conventional system is forcing them to do, and increasingly they can't do what their hearts are in there to do. And so in some ways, as we started moving into this testing environment, I thought, even though it seems awful for children and what, I think we've got the outcomes in the country now, in terms of convincing people that conventional ed doesn't work, this could have been, a helpful push. I think a lot of people are saying, we got to be doing something different out here. On the other hand, we do, as Angela and Karen both said, you got to speak the language to some extent, and that's what's so hard. I mean, I find I go across the street to the School of Ed, and they speak a different language, and I noticed Paige was just on for a second. You see it in anywhere you go. So like, for example, when we decided to go ahead and do the test score study, where we went and we culled proficiency levels off the 10 states that have the most public Montessori's test scores, it wasn't because we care about test scores, but given that that's some people, and in fact, when I asked my undergrads, what was the purpose of school up until you came to UVA, most of them will raise their hands and say raising our test scores. They feel like that was the purpose. So if that's what some people think the purpose is, let's see how Montessori does at it, even though we've got other values. And I think the world's a much better place if we can get schools to think about other things that are important, like human flourishing.
Yeah. I see that Lettie, I think, has a question or a comment. Oh, you're on mute, Lettie.
Sorry about that. I think it's more of a comment of like that, what you said just resonated so deeply, Angeline. And I think that the thing I'm struggling with is like, there's never been a time that we've had more research that shows that these things are not okay. And yet there's never been a greater time when people are ignoring that and doing the opposite. And so we have all this wonderful research that's coming out, but if people aren't applying it, I just am like, well, how do we get people to apply it is what I wonder. It's where I struggle sometimes.
Yeah, and I think one of the missions of the AERA Montessori SIG is that very thing, to sort of elevate the conversation and engage in discussions with people who tend to have a pretty narrow definition of success in education, and try to expand on that and really broaden the conversation. So having folks like you a part of this conversation and demonstrating that the interest exists, and having a publication like the Handbook, which hopefully balances some of that, speaking the language of the mainstream academic expectations, while at the same time really capturing some of the essence of what Montessori is all about, I think can hopefully help move that idea forward. Any other questions Lauren, please, and you are on mute. I will let you know that.
Thank you. I have two quick questions if we have enough time. My first question is, it sounds like you're having to pull public Montessori schools. So I'm curious if like the dilution of Montessori in America really affects like what you have access to, because research at a private Montessori school would look totally different, I think, from a public Montessori school in like what you're looking at for outcomes. How do you navigate having so many varieties in Montessori, if that makes
Yeah, I think that goes to that question of fidelity, which is the chapter that I wrote with my colleague. And I think you have a couple of competing things going on. On the one hand, you have the importance of finding environments that have generalizability so that the field can see that this is a potentially an educational approach that has potential impact beyond just the private school setting. So it's important from that standpoint to be doing research in public Montessori schools. And then you also have the inherent bias in studying children whose parents make the choice and have the resources to send them to private schools. And you have to balance that with this question of fidelity and how is Montessori being implemented in public spaces. So I think you highlight a really important question, and one that researchers are definitely trying to balance. But as the field really wants to focus on expanding access to Montessori education, that really makes research in those publicly funded spaces really important. And I welcome input from anybody else that has ideas there.
In the chapter, Lauren, I didn't limit the summary of the research to public Montessori, but I think most of the studies were done with public Montessori because of the availability of data, like you said. The study that Angeline and I are working on together, that is a large national study, randomized control trial of Montessori early childhood programs, is entirely in the public schools because, as Angela said, it's really important to understand the efficacy of Montessori as it expands and as it's serving a more diverse group of students socioeconomically. But we were really focused on identifying what, through Angeline's leadership, sort of what high fidelity Montessori means, and only selecting schools to participate in the study that met those criteria in terms of duration of work period and teacher training and ratios and full set of materials and not having extra materials and so we thought about what that definition of fidelity would look like for our national study. So that study is underway right now. Kids are getting assessed in their 4-year-old year in like 7 states, I believe. So we're excited to see what that brings.
Thank you.
Angela, do you have anything to add to that? Or
Yeah, I certainly, because public schools are required to take these tests, sometimes as often as every 6 weeks, get them ready for another test. It certainly distracts from the program, but I also think there's a lot of good Montessori happening in the public sector, and I wouldn't just write them all off because of having to do the tests. Some of them say, yeah, we have to teach a bit about it, but a lot of it is just in the course of what is done, so that, when they're really doing real Montessori, the children end up doing fine on those tests and they don't have to step out that much. But, we'll see. It's important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. My follow-up, and it relates in a weird way. I'm curious if you ran into or up against stereotypes or prejudices around Montessori. I just know, like, as a Montessori teacher and a student, I hear it all the time, but maybe just not in like quite an academic realm. So I'm curious, how is the research regarded academically? Because this is like where I'm trying to go, and it's scary to say, here's what I'm interested in doing, researching Montessori. Do you have space for this kind of study? So I would really love to hear what you're up against.
I think it looked like Angeline had something she was dying to say.
I think the research is really well accepted. What gets me is the number of and I'm just speaking from UVA, the professors of education, the number of them that love Montessori, send their children to Montessori, sometimes even were former Montessori teachers, but will tell you that they can't imagine that Montessori could work for all children, that they can't imagine it. You need way too many teachers for this to work. You need way too big of spaces for this to work. You need way more money than the public schools have. And so it's getting at those prejudices. And Joel Parnham and Kalinda Bass-Barlow and I have an op-ed that we're sending around to papers, hoping someplace will accept it, where we're trying to address those myths, because there's a lot of myths, and we have to just keep talking to those folks and pounding it in there that they keep trying to reinvent education. I mean, it's happening all over. You see this catchphrase of reinvent education. We've been doing it wrong. What are we going to do? And they just ignore the fact that there's this system that's been around a long time that gets it right in pretty much any way I can think of.
Yeah, and I think too, what you related, Angeline, is absolutely what we saw at the AERA booth. We had more people stop in at the booth. So the exhibit hall at AERA is full of computer software folks and publishers. And so we decided to rock the boat a little bit. And we did have our books, including the handbook. But we brought in Montessori materials, compliments of Seton Montessori, which is located in Chicago. And we sparked some amazing conversations. And it was just that. It was, my kids go to Montessori. Montessori is great. Gosh, I never thought about using Montessori as an angle for my own research, And so it's some of that grassroots work, being visible and being present at spaces like AERA, having the handbook on the shelf lined up with all the other handbooks with a very lovely eye-catching cover, I have to say, begins to hopefully generate some of that credibility just because we're present and visible in those spaces more now. And so I think that is important.
And the Journal of Montessori Research as
yes,
well.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that also contributes. So some really important things are happening. I mean, I think about the time since I started my dissertation and how far the field has come and how many more resources there are and how many more people are supportive of research in Montessori education. It's an exciting time to be involved because there's so much work to be done. But it's also, it doesn't feel quite as much like we're on an island doing the work all by ourselves the way it did back in 2007, 2008.
Thank you. Thanks.
And let me know too, I mean, there's the meta-analysis that just came out, and then there's another one that I'm last author on that Campbell Collaborative Reviews should put up on their website any day now, that's also been accepted. So we've got two meta-analyses at the same time just coming out.